Chapter 6 begins on a bit of a new topic. The first 5 chapters were largely about the laws of prayer, initially the Shema and then the Amidah. Now we're moving on to the topic of blessings, generally before and after food. Briefly, there are specific blessings said for each type of food. The blessing said on bread is the blessing of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. The blessing said on wine is Borei Puri HaGefen. The blessing said on foods made from grain is Borei Mine Mizonot. The blessing said on fruits is Borei Puri Ha'etz. The blessing said on vegetables is Borei Puri Ha'dama. And the blessing said on everything else is Shehakal Nihya Bidvaro. So, whichever one of those is always said before eating any food, along with an after blessing said afterwards, which itself is dependent on the type of food, the most significant of which is bread. So, the first Mishnah begins by listing most of the blessings said, again, a different one being for each type of food listed here. It also lists an opinion of Rabbi Yehuda towards a different blessing on vegetables, being Borei Mine Dishaim, but as you'll see later, this isn't the accepted opinion. The Gemara says the source for this is the verse, "Sanctify for praises before the Lord," praises being plural, implying 2 blessings by eating, one before and one after. Some, however, disagree, saying this verse is used to teach about wine libations in the temple, and we actually learn we need to make the after blessing from a point about vineyards. There's an extra word which implies this, and then based on the fact that you make an after blessing, you can conclude from that you for sure make a before blessing when you're actually hungry. And it's not just by grapevines, it's by all foods, as all foods satiate you, not just grapes. And furthermore, grapes are not unique, even though they have special laws of giving certain grapes to charity, and also grain has similar charity laws. Point is, both have benefit derived from them and have blessings, so the same applies to all foods. We spend a little longer trying to figure out exactly how we learn the source for food blessings. It's mentioned that there is a special blessing for the 7 fruits of Israel, including these 2, the total being wheat, barley, olives, pomegranates, grapes, figs, and dates. Final point is that you shouldn't benefit from the world in general without saying a blessing first, and to prevent this, you should learn the blessings. The same applies if you don't say the blessing after. It then lists a few negative concepts towards people who don't say these blessings, which branches into a brief point about whether it's more worthwhile to focus on Torah study or work, the conclusion of which is to focus on Torah study first, as people who focus on work first always end up compromising on their Torah study. In fact, the earlier, better generations prioritized Torah study first, unlike the later generations. Similarly, the earlier generations would properly adhere to the laws of tithes, while the later generations would use loopholes to get out of them. Okay, back to blessings. There's a blessing said on fruit, but then a different blessing said on wine. Why exactly is that? We don't say a different blessing on olive oil, even though there's a similar change. So, there are a few answers suggested. Maybe we couldn't figure out a proper formatting for the blessing, maybe because only wine provides nourishment, both of which aren't actually true. In actuality, wine has a unique special blessing, as it satisfies 2. We don't, however, consider it to have the same status as bread, with all the extra blessings that apply by it, as people's meals don't revolve around wine, unlike by bread, which they do. If you do decide to base your meal on wine, however, well, we don't really know, so for now, just still say the normal blessings. Then we spend a bit trying to figure out exactly when you would need to be saying a blessing over olive oil. It's not drinking it plain, as that's bad for you. It's not as a dip for bread, as then you'd say the blessing on the primary food there, which would be the bread. It's not where it's being used as a mixture in a dip along with boiled vegetable water, which was something eaten back then apparently, as again, that's not the primary part of the dish. Rather, you would say a blessing on olive oil if you're consuming it for medicinal reasons, and normally you don't make a blessing on medicines, but you do here, as it's also kind of a food that you enjoy. Then there's a bit of conversation as to what blessing you make on plain wheat flour, whether you say the vegetable blessing you'd make on wheat, or the miscellaneous food blessing, and we try to bring proofs by similarities by olives, but no, you say the miscellaneous food blessing, and also the same applies by barley too, which actually has a blessing in spite of the fact that it's not great to eat it plain. Then there's an argument about the blessing over hearts of palm, if it's the vegetable blessing, as it's a vegetable, or the miscellaneous blessing, as it's kind of going to be a tree. We can't bring evidence from radishes and caper bushes, as the intent when you plant the two is completely different. In the end, we say the rule by Heart of Palm is the miscellaneous blessing. Then it gets into caper bushes for a bit, and we see that basically all of its produce, its fronds, berries, and buds are all considered fruits and have the status for all the laws of tithes and otherwise. Others say only the berries are considered fruits, and that's the opinion we hold like. We just brought both opinions because we wanted to teach that if somebody holds a lenient opinion in this regard, we hold to that rule outside of Israel and apply the more strict opinion inside of Israel, and this applies to many laws of trees, not just by tithes. Although technically you can eat the berries due to a few other leniencies if it's outside of Israel. Then we get into a bit of a longer conversation as to why exactly the buds of this plant are not fully considered its fruit. We cite points from pomegranates and what parts of that are considered fruit and what isn't. We bring a bunch of points largely as to whether the additional parts of the plant are protecting the fruit, which in the case of the buds they are not, hence they are not considered a part and may be eaten when the berries may not, and also have a different blessing, the blessing for vegetables, unlike the berries which have the blessing for fruits. Then there's an argument about a pepper plant, if you need to make a blessing or not, or if it's considered a fruit. Some say no, some say yes. We say yes, you say a blessing when it's fresh, but if it's dried pepper, you don't, and the same applies by ginger. Then it discusses the blessing on a cake sort of food, something made from flour, grain, honey, and oil, and you say the 5 grain blessings on this, which is said on the 5 grains, and any food that contains them, with the exception of bread, of course, which has its own special blessing. This does, by the way, exclude rice or millet in any form, over which you say the miscellaneous food blessing and the short after blessing, unlike by grain food, which has a longer after blessing. There are some stringencies listed to consider rice as a grain occasionally, hence many have the custom to not eat rice on Passover. Some say if you eat raw rice, you say the vegetable blessing, and if it's cooked, you say the grain blessing. There are many opinions by rice, and it's one of the few foods that we have a very difficult time defining what blessing to say on it. In regards to eating raw grain, we say the vegetable blessing, but one opinion says to say a special blessing for seeds and herbs, and we don't hold like this. There are further opinions listed about the 7 fruits of Israel, and a bit more complication over rice, but that's the idea. In that cake thing mentioned earlier, it's the grain blessing, but if you make it with less wheat, to the point where honey is the main ingredient in the dish, some say it's the miscellaneous blessing, but then change their mind and say that it's still the grain blessing. If the dish has bread, at a minimum, pieces the size of an olive, then you say the bread blessing. If not, then you don't. If you have a bunch of crumbs and re-solidify them into bread by kneading it with water, or if the crumbs come from proper loaves, then you'd say the bread blessing. In the end, we say as long as they still resemble bread, even if they are very small crumbs, then you say the bread blessing. There are also some weird forms of bread listed, which aren't really fully considered bread, and you aren't obligated to separate challah from them. Also, there are some bread-adjacent foods that we say the grain blessing on, not the bread blessing, and some even say you can use them as matzah on Passover. On date honey, we say the miscellaneous blessing, not the fruit blessing, as it's just liquid exuded from the fruit. Crushed dates, however, retain the blessing of the fruit one. We then discussed another pastry-related food, a mixture of flour, oil, and salt. Some say the blessing is the grain one, while others say it's the miscellaneous one, depending on whether or not you make it thin, which means the intent is to use it as medicine, and you say a blessing even then, as it's still a food you enjoy eating. Then there's some conversation if the blessing for bread is hamotzi lechem min haaretz, or just motzi lechem min haaretz, depending on the connotation of the words. We say it's the former, in spite of some disagreement. We then move from the bread blessing onto the vegetable blessing, and we say it's juxtaposed to the bread blessing, because the same way bread is cooked and has its blessing, if vegetables are cooked, they also retain their blessing. Some hold that if it's normally eaten raw, like leeks or garlic, you say the vegetable blessing, and when cooked, the miscellaneous blessing, and vice versa, if it's generally eaten cooked. There's a few opinions on this topic about cooked or uncooked vegetables, but that's the idea. One of the details of which is if an olive requires a blessing if the pit is removed, as the size of an olive is generally the minimum for application of these laws, so if you remove the olive's pit, then it would have its size reduced past that minimum threshold. So we say that it's permissible if it's a larger species of olive. Then there's a quick story about a rabbi and his two students were eating, and one of the students messed up his blessing, and the other people made fun of him, so the rabbi got upset at both of them. The mistake made was that there was two foods, and some hold you say the blessing on your preferred food of the two, while others say you say the blessing on the one that provides more sustenance. Okay, now about turnips. Some say you say different blessings based on what size it's cut. If it's small, the miscellaneous blessing as opposed to the vegetable one. Others say you just always do the vegetable blessing because cutting it smaller is actually just to make it taste sweeter. There's a similar point brought about a beet and flour dish. Some people say there's different blessings based on how much flour is added. If there's a little, then vegetable blessing. If it's a lot, then the grain blessing. Others say to say the vegetable blessing either way, as the grain is only to act as adhesion. Side point. I mentioned that apparently beets are very healthy for your heart and eyes, particularly if they're cooked well. Then I mentioned soups, that the blessing on soup is what the main vegetable is. There's a brief question about dill in soup, what its purpose is, and it says that it has the same status as other vegetables. Then we get into a brief discussion about bread, and say that you say the blessing on bread and only then break it. If you have slices of bread and also loaves, some say to say the blessing on the slices, others to say the blessing on the loaves. If they are made of different grains, then say the blessing on the wheat one. If you want to be safe, hold all of them while saying the blessing. This is done by the matzah on Passover, specifically with broken matzah, as it says to use bread of poverty. On Shabbos, we need to break bread over 2 whole loaves. Some would only break one of them, or use a single big piece off one, and that's fine and not seen as voracious, as long as that's not what you would usually do during the week. Some would say a blessing on and eat their Eruv Chatzerut bread, which is a custom discussed more in later tractates. I'm not going to get into it too much over here. It then mentions some things you can and cannot interrupt your bread blessing with, and it says to always make sure to feed your animals before you eat. Also, you shouldn't break the bread until they bring salt to everybody, if that bread requires it. Completely unrelated topic, it then mentions how to properly urinate, either while sitting or onto loose earth, or other options. Not much sure what that has to do with bread, but whatever. It also says, for health reasons, eat salt after eating anything and drink water after drink anything. You should also drink lots of water, a flask of water for every loaf of bread. It also mentions some other healthy habits, such as occasionally eating lentils and mustard, to eat small fish, and fennel. Although it says the smell of fennel is bad for you, but not the taste. We then mentioned that earlier suggested blessing, an individual blessing for herbs, which is rejected here based on how we interpret a verse. Then we say how God is greater than a mortal. As with mortals, an empty vessel holds things and a full vessel cannot, while with God, a full vessel, somebody who has lots of Torah knowledge, can always acquire more, while somebody who has a lack of Torah knowledge, meaning like an empty vessel, has a more difficult time acquiring Torah knowledge. It then mentions from some verses to listen the first time learning, or do lots of review. And that brings us to a new Mishnah. If you eat a fruit and say the vegetable blessing, then that's sufficient. If you say the miscellaneous blessing on any food at all, then that works. The Gemara brings a source for these statements and then says that the second statement, that saying the fruit blessing on a vegetable, is insufficient, specifically to teach that a fruit is considered a fruit only if the branch that it grew from will then produce more of that fruit, excluding things like wheat. Everything else that doesn't fit that criteria has the vegetable blessing set on it. The next thing we said was that, technically speaking, the miscellaneous blessing suffices for every food. Some say this includes bread or wine, others disagree based on whether you hold you can deviate from the established terminology of blessing, or some say you need to actually mention the word bread or wine in your blessing. We also cite an incident where somebody said a modified blessing on bread, not like the official terminology, but he mentioned the word bread and also said God's name and said the after blessing, so it was valid. This is brought to teach that we can say the after blessing in whatever language you want, and we know you can say the regular blessing in any language from a different source. In general, a blessing requires mention of God's name and God's sovereignty over the world based on some verses. New Mishnah. Every other miscellaneous food has the miscellaneous blessing set on it. Some say negative foods, like vinegar, bad dates, or locusts, don't get a blessing. If you have many fruits in front of you, some say to say the blessing for one of the 7 fruits, if that's one of them. Others say to say the blessing on the fruit that you prefer the most. The Gemara says that the things included in the miscellaneous blessing is basically everything else: meat, milk, eggs, cheese, or bad foods like spoiled bread or wine, on salt, mushrooms, and otherwise. By the way, mushrooms are one of the few vegetables that don't get the vegetable blessing, as they don't absorb nourishment from the ground, rather through the air. When we said bad dates earlier, some say that refers to dates that are sunburnt, others say it refers to windblown dates. So according to him, they aren't really a bad food, but those must be disregarded because you wouldn't make the miscellaneous blessing on those. You'd make the fruit blessing, so clearly it's not referring to windblown dates. It must be referring to sunburnt dates. This is also backed up from another source, which discusses various types of dates. However, that other place uses a different word to refer to sunburnt dates, not the word used here, so that's left off as an unresolved question. The next topic was that if you have a bunch of vegetables in front of you, which of them do you say the blessing on? Of course, this is if they're all the same blessing. If they're different blessings, you just have to say the different blessings. We try to bring a disproof from a case where somebody had two different types of vegetables and said one blessing, but that's a different case where either one of them was the primary dish, or that one of them was one of the 7 fruits of Israel, and in those cases you would only say one blessing. In fact, if the blessing is the same by 2 fruits, some say you say the blessing on your preference, others say that you say the blessing on the one that's one of Israel's 7 fruits. If they are different blessings, however, you say both blessings. Some say there is further disagreement in this case as to which of the 2 blessings you say first. Some say according to the order of the fruits listed in a verse. In fact, each of the 7 fruits of Israel, in order wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates, are each individually used at some point as a form of measurement, hence the purpose of this verse. Some say the verse is just simply to list the fruits. So, as established, normally you'd say the blessing in the order of the list of the fruits, but one time somebody said the blessing on the date, which is last, before the blessing on the pomegranate, which is earlier on in the list. He did this because the word land is reused in the verse and is actually closer to the word dates than pomegranates, so therefore he said the blessing on the dates first. If someone brings you some fruits, grapes or figs in the middle of your meal, some say you only say a first blessing, others say you also say an after blessing, as is usually done after a first blessing. However, simply, if you ate bread at the beginning of the meal and said the blessings, that covers all the blessings for the entire meal. Furthermore, if there is a side food that's a part of the meal, it requires no blessings for itself. If it's not a part of the meal, but is eaten during it, only say the before blessing. If it's eaten after the meal, say all of the blessings. Wine is excluded in all of this. It requires its own blessing, even if you ate bread. Then it goes back on a few points about the earlier mentioned bread-adjacent dishes. Then it mentions a few opinions as to what exactly constitutes the end of a meal, be it when the bread is removed from the table, when the host finishes the meal, when you wash your hands, but we say it's immediately after you wash your hands, and then you say the after blessing. And then we say that just as immediately as that, it's immediate that a Torah scholar receives his reward. New Mishnah. If you say the blessing on wine at the beginning of a meal, that covers wine drunk at the end of the meal. The same applies to any side dishes you say blessings on at the beginning of meals and then eat more of at the end. Saying a blessing on bread covers other foods, but not vice versa, with Beis Shammai adding that this doesn't even cover the obligation for the blessing on porridge, which is something we'll try to explain later. If you're all sitting together, you each say the blessings. If you're all reclining together, one person says the blessings for everybody. If wine is brought out during the meal, each person says his own blessing. If it's brought out at the end, then you say the blessing for everybody, and also the blessing on incense, although it's a bit early for that. The Gemara says that the first rule, that the blessing on wine at the beginning of the meal also covers for the end of the meal, specifically applies by Shabbos and holidays, as those meals are established around wine. This rule doesn't apply the rest of the year. We bring a number of proofs for this. There's also a bit of an argument as to if there's a difference in this rule between wine for drink and wine for tasting. Beis Shammai mentioned that point about porridge. We try to figure out exactly where his context was and all that, and we cannot. We said if you recline and not sit, one person says the blessings. This also applies if you pre-designated the meal together. There's a story that backs this up where some sages after a funeral did this. This reclining thing is specifically by bread, by the way. There's an argument if it also applies by wine. Also, as a part of the wine argument, it doesn't apply if some of the people are sitting more outside. We said that only if you get wine at the end of the meal can one person cover the blessing for everybody. This is because during the meal, everybody is preoccupied with eating and won't pay attention. Also, we say the person who washes his hands first at the end of the meal lead to the after blessing. As for the blessing on incense, you say it preemptively before actually smelling the incense, specifically when you see the smoke rise, similar to how you say the blessing on bread prior to actually eating it. Then we list some of the blessings over incense, which becomes an unresolved argument. Then it lists a bunch of different blessings for a bunch of different smells of a bunch of different plants, which leads into a bunch of miscellaneous teachings. It says that God made everyone's craft appear beautiful in his eyes. Then, in regards to warding off demons, you can't attack if there's two people, and a torch can suffice as your second person, and they won't appear at all if there's three people. And the moon can act for you as three people. Then it says that it's better to toss yourself into a furnace than to embarrass somebody publicly. Then it lists a few more opinions on the blessing of scents, and that's that for that topic. Then it gets a bit sidetracked again, saying there are 6 things a Torah scholar should not do. Go out with perfume on your clothes, and according to some, on your hair. You shouldn't go out alone at night, as it could look like you're up to no good, unless you have a known teaching schedule. Don't go out with patched shoes if the patches are visible. Don't converse with any women in the street. Don't recline with unlearned people in case they rub off on you, and don't be the last to enter your study hall. Also, some say don't take long strides, as it's bad for your health, but that can be healed by drinking Kiddush wine. And lastly, some add not to walk with an erect, haughty posture, as God is everywhere, and you don't want to do that before him. Okay, new Mishnah. If you have bread and a salted food that is primary over the bread, then the salted food covers the bread. In fact, as a general rule, saying the blessing on the primary food covers any other secondary foods there. The Gemara says that the food that is primary over bread is a certain type of special fruit that it goes into a great detail, describing how good it is. Then it speaks a little bit about the great abundance of food in Israel, and about how many Kohanim brothers would marry a different families, many Kohanim sisters. Then it says, according to some, a meal is only considered a meal if it has salt, others say if it has soup, and that brings us to a new Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel says if you eat one of the 7 fruits of Israel, you say the full after blessing. The rabbis say you say the shortened version. Rabbi Akiva says you say the full version on even a regular cooked vegetable if it satiated you. If you drink water, you say the miscellaneous blessing, and others say you say the shorter after blessing. They provide their reasons in the Gemara sourced from verses, but it rules that we say the shorter version of the after blessing. It then lists the texts of the various after blessings and some opinions on variations on them. It then mentions some other practical cases, what to do by water, by vegetables, the sources for those, all pretty standard and known about stuff. Then it goes on about how amazing an egg is. First it says that an egg is the single best egg-sized food, and depending on how it's cooked, has lots of health benefits. Also, Rabbi Akiva mentioned a cooked vegetable that satiates you. This refers to a stalk of cabbage. This is sourced from a lengthy diatribe about healthy foods, and it mentions this about cabbage. In fact, pretty much the rest of this page is just dedicated to listing different health benefits and practices of different foods. Then it ends off by saying that if you want to know the proper procedure by water, just check to see what everybody else does, which is, of course, to say the miscellaneous blessing, and afterwards, as the after blessing, say the short after blessing of Borei Nefashos. And with that, that brings us to the end of chapter 6.